A poor waitress finds a shivering child behind a trash can. That child is the son of Pennsylvania's most dangerous mafia boss. She just wants to save a baby, but she doesn't know that this decision will drag her into a clandestine war from which no one will emerge unscathed. This story will keep you on the edge of your seat from beginning to end. Watch until the very end, like the video, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. It fell on Ashridge Hollow the way grief falls on a person who's stopped fighting it. Steady, gray, without mercy. The kind of rain that turned dirt roads into mud rivers and made the neon sign outside Maple House Diner flicker like a dying heartbeat. The kind that kept the truckers hunched over their coffee longer than usual, staring out windows at nothing, waiting for something that never came. Clara Bennett wiped the counter for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Not because it was dirty, because her hands needed something to do, or they'd start shaking again. The electric bill sat folded in her apron pocket, numbers she'd already memorized. $312, due in 6 days. She had 87 in checking, and whatever tips the lunch crowd decided to leave, which on a Wednesday in late October in a town most GPS systems forgot existed, meant close to nothing. She was 24 years old and felt 50. The diner smelled the way it always smelled. Burned coffee, bacon grease soaked into wood that hadn't been replaced since the Reagan administration, and something faintly metallic from the kitchen pipes Earl kept promising to fix. Earl owned Maple House. He was 63, widowed, and drank whiskey from a thermos he thought nobody noticed. Clara noticed. She noticed everything. That was her curse. The breakfast rush, if you could call 4 truckers and Old Dale Perkins a rush, had come and gone. Clara refilled the sugar dispensers and checked the clock above the register. 9:42. The lunch crowd wouldn't show for another 2 hours. She had side work to do. Roll silverware, restock the walk-in, haul yesterday's trash out to the dumpster because the night guy called in sick again. She grabbed the trash bags, 2 in each hand, and shouldered open the back door. The cold hit her like a slap. October in western Pennsylvania carried a particular kind of cruelty. Not the dramatic cold of a blizzard, but a damp, bone-deep chill that crawled under your skin and stayed there. Claire's jacket was too thin. She'd been meaning to buy a new one since last winter. She'd been meaning to do a lot of things. The dumpster sat against the back wall of the diner, wedged between the building and a chain-link fence that separated the parking lot from an abandoned lumber yard. She swung the first bag up and over the rim. The second bag caught on something and tore, spilling coffee grounds and wet napkins down the side of the dumpster. Damn it! She crouched to gather the mess, and that's when she heard it. Breathing. Not the scurry of a raccoon or the rustle of wind through trash. This was human breathing, shallow, rapid, the kind that comes from someone trying desperately to be quiet and failing. Clara froze with her hands full of wet garbage. The sound came from behind the dumpster, from the narrow gap between the metal container and the fence. Every rational instinct told her to go back inside. Lock the door. Call someone. In a town like Ashridge Hollow, you didn't investigate strange noises in alleys. You minded your business because minding your business was how you stayed alive in a place where half the population had a reason to stay hidden. But Clara had never been good at walking away from things. She dropped the trash and stepped around the dumpster slowly, keeping her weight on her toes the way her mother used to tell her. Quiet feet, Clara, quiet feet. And peered into the gap. A boy, small, dark-haired, pressed into the corner where the fence met the wall, knees pulled tight to his chest, arms wrapped around himself like he was trying to hold his own body together. His eyes found hers and went wide, not with relief, but with the specific terror of a creature that had been hunted and knew the hunter was close. Clara's breath caught. He couldn't have been older than 8. His face was pale beneath smudges of dirt, lips slightly blue from cold. His clothes were wrong. That was the first thing that registered beyond the shock. Not wrong as in damaged, though they were dirty and torn at the knee. Wrong as in they didn't belong here. The jacket was dark wool, tailored, the kind of thing she'd seen in magazine ads, but never on an actual child in Ashridge Hollow. His shoes were leather, scuffed now, but obviously expensive. And on his left wrist, half hidden by his sleeve, something caught the gray light. A watch. Heavy, silver. The kind men wore in boardrooms, not the kind that belonged on a child's arm. Clara lowered herself to a crouch, making herself small. She kept her voice barely above a whisper. Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. The boy pressed harder against the wall. His chest rose and fell too fast. His fingers were white from gripping his own arms. Are you lost? Clara asked. Stupid question. Of course he was lost. Or worse. No answer. Just those eyes. Dark, enormous, watching her the way a rabbit watches a shadow pass overhead. My name's Clara. I work here in the diner. Are you hungry? Something shifted in his face at the word. Not trust. Not yet. But a crack in the wall he'd built around himself, the smallest fracture. Clara didn't push. She stood up slowly, backed away 3 steps, and went inside. She came back 4 minutes later with a plate of pancakes, a glass of warm milk, and a wool blanket she kept in her locker for the night she worked doubles and slept in the break room. She set everything down at the entrance to the Gap, then sat on the wet asphalt with her back against the dumpster, facing away from him, giving him space, giving him the choice. For a long time she heard nothing but rain and his breathing. Then the scrape of a plate being pulled across concrete. She didn't turn around. She sat in the rain and listened to a starving child eat pancakes 3 feet behind her. And something old and heavy shifted inside her chest. Something that had been locked down since her mother died. Since the hospital bills ate everything. Since she'd learned that caring about people was just another word for volunteering to get hurt. The eating stopped. A long pause. Then a voice so small it almost disappeared under the rain. Nico. Clara turned her head slightly. What? My name. A swallow. Nico. She nodded once, still not looking directly at him. Okay, Nico. You want to come inside where it's warm? Another long pause. Then the sound of small feet on wet ground, and a hand, freezing, trembling, slipped into hers. Clara led him through the back door, past the kitchen where the cook glanced up with a frown she silenced with a look, and into the storage room at the end of the hallway. It was small, cluttered with boxes of canned goods and restaurant supplies, but it was dry and warm and had a space heater that actually worked. She sat Nico on an overturned milk crate, wrapped the blanket tighter around his shoulders, and knelt in front of him. In the fluorescent light of the storage room, the details sharpened. The jacket was Italian. She could see the label peeking from the collar, some brand she couldn't pronounce. His fingernails were clean beneath the dirt, recently trimmed. His hair had been professionally cut, not long ago. Everything about this child screamed money, the serious kind, the kind that built walls between itself and the rest of the world. Nico, she said carefully. Where are your parents? His jaw tightened. A micro-expression, adult in its control, passed across his face and vanished. I can't go back. Back where? Home. He said the word like it tasted wrong. Did someone hurt you? He shook his head, then stopped, then shook it again, slower, like he wasn't sure of the answer himself. Not like that. They didn't hit me. I'm not a person there. I'm a thing they keep inside a box. Clara felt her stomach drop. She'd heard stories, kids in bad situations, kids who ran from things adults couldn't imagine. But something about the way this boy spoke wasn't consistent with abuse, at least not the kind she understood. It was loneliness. A deep, structural loneliness, the kind that gets built into the architecture of a life. Who's they? She asked. My father. His people. His people? Nico looked at her, and for the first time something harder surfaced behind the fear, something that didn't belong in a child's eyes. You don't want to know who my father is. The words hung in the small room. Clara felt goosebumps crawl up her arms that had nothing to do with the cold. She didn't press. Not yet. Instead, she brought him more food, a turkey sandwich, apple juice, a packet of crackers from the shelf. He ate with the mechanical focus of someone who'd gone too long without. Between bites, small details emerged. He'd been walking for 2 days. He'd slept in a gas station bathroom the first night and under a bridge the second. He'd been afraid to ask anyone for help because they would call someone, and if someone was called, those people would come. What people? Clara asked. The men who work for my father. Your father sent men to look for you? Nico's hands tightened around the juice box. My father has a lot of men. Clara sat back on her heels. The reasonable thing, the sane thing, was to call the police. File a report. Let the system handle it. That's what you did when you found a lost child. That's what responsible adults did. But Nico had looked at her when she mentioned calling anyone, and the fear that flooded his face wasn't the fear of a child who'd be scolded for running away. It was the fear of someone who'd been caught. And the distinction mattered. She made a decision that would later keep her up at night questioning everything she thought she knew about right and wrong. You can stay here for now, she told him, but I need to figure some things out. Can you be quiet? Can you stay in this room while I work? He nodded, fast, grateful. The relief in his eyes made her chest hurt. Clara closed the storage room door and leaned against it, pressing her palms flat against the wood. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She was a waitress. She made $7 an hour plus tips. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment above Kellner's Hardware with a radiator that only worked on the left side of the room. She had no business hiding someone's child in a diner storage room. She had no business getting involved in whatever this was. But she kept seeing his hands, those small, trembling hands wrapped around a juice box in a storage room that smelled like canned tomatoes and bleach. She went back to work, smiled at the lunch customers, poured coffee, cleared plates. Every 20 minutes, she checked the storage room. Each time, Nico was exactly where she'd left him, sitting perfectly still on the milk crate, watching the door like he expected it to burst open at any moment. At 3 o'clock, Earl told her to take over the register while he went to the bank. The diner was nearly empty. Just old Dale at his usual booth and a woman Clara didn't recognize reading a newspaper near the window. Clara was counting change when the bell above the front door chimed. 2 men walked in. They weren't from Ashridge Hollow. That was obvious immediately. Their clothes were too sharp, too dark, too deliberate. One was tall, with a shaved head and hands that looked like they'd been used for things hands shouldn't be used for. The other was shorter, thicker, wearing sunglasses indoors on a day when the sun hadn't shown its face in a week. They sat at the counter. The tall one smiled at Clara, and the smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Coffee," he said. 2. Clara poured. Her hands were steady. She'd learned long ago to keep her hands steady when the rest of her was falling apart. "Quiet town," the tall one said, looking around the diner. "We're passing through. You live around here?" "Born and raised," Clara said. She set the mugs down without making eye contact. "Good. Maybe you can help us." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a photograph. A professional photograph, the kind taken in a studio with soft lighting and a neutral background. The boy in the picture was clean, well-groomed, wearing a crisp white shirt. His dark curls were perfect. His expression was the carefully constructed blankness of a child trained to perform for cameras. It was Nico. "We're looking for this kid," the tall man said. "His family's worried sick. He wandered off from a relative's house a couple days ago. Have you seen him?" Clara looked at the photograph. She looked at it for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to seem like she was trying to remember, not so long it looked like she was stalling. Then she shook her head. "Can't say I have. But it's been slow the past few days. Rain keeps people inside." The shorter man hadn't spoken. He was watching Clara with a stillness that made her skin crawl. His eyes moved from her face to her hands to the hallway behind the counter, and she could feel him cataloging everything, filing it away. "You sure?" the tall one said, still smiling. "Small town like this, a kid would stand out." "I'm sure. You might want to check with the sheriff's office. It's up on Route 6, about 3 miles. The tall man held her gaze for a beat too long. Then he nodded, dropped a 20 on the counter for 2 cups of coffee, and stood up. The shorter man followed without a word. They walked out. The bell chimed. Through the window, Clara watched them climb into a black Chevrolet Suburban with tinted windows. It pulled out of the lot and turned east on the main road. Clara waited until it was gone. Then she walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and threw up in the toilet. She knelt on the cold tile floor, her forehead against the porcelain, breathing in shallow gasps. She'd just lied to 2 men who were clearly not relatives searching for a wandering child. The photograph was professional. The $20 tip was a signal. And the way the shorter one had watched her, that wasn't concern. That was assessment. These were professionals. and they were looking for the boy hiding in her storage room. When her shift ended at 6, Clara smuggled Nico out the back door wrapped in her jacket. The rain had turned to a cold drizzle. She walked fast, keeping to the side streets, cutting through the alley behind the post office, and up the back stairs of Kellner's Hardware to her apartment. It wasn't much. A living room that doubled as a bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, a bathroom with a shower that took 4 minutes to get warm. But it was hers, and right now it was the only place she could think clearly. She sat Nico on the couch and microwaved leftover soup. While he ate, she stood by the window, peeking through the curtain at the street below. Nothing unusual, just rain and the yellow glow of the hardware store sign reflecting off wet asphalt. "Nico," she said, not turning from the window, "I need you to tell me the truth, all of it. Because 2 men came into the diner today looking for you, and they weren't police, and they weren't social workers, and they sure as hell weren't your relatives." The boy set down his spoon. When she turned to look at him, his face had changed. The childish vulnerability was still there, but beneath it was something else. A resignation that no 8-year-old should carry. "My father's name is Salvatore De Luca," he said quietly. "He lives in Pittsburgh. He runs things." "What kind of things?" Nico looked at his soup. "Everything." The name hit Clara like a physical force. She didn't follow the news religiously, but you didn't grow up in western Pennsylvania without hearing the name De Luca. It surfaced in whispers at bars, in newspaper headlines that never quite connected the dots, in the careful silences of people who knew better than to say too much. Salvatore De Luca, the man who reportedly controlled half the underground economy between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, the man whose name made prosecutors change the subject and judges find reasons to recuse themselves. The ghost who built an empire so deep inside the infrastructure of legitimate business that pulling him out would collapse the whole structure, and his 8-year-old son was sitting on her couch eating Campbell's chicken noodle soup. Clara gripped the curtain. Her knuckles went white. "You're telling me your father is Salvatore De Luca?" Nico nodded. "And those men at the diner, they work for him. He has a lot of them. They'll find me eventually. They always do." "You've done this before? Run away?" "Twice. They brought me back both times. The first time my father didn't speak to me for 3 days. The second time he cried." Nico paused. "That was worse." Clara sank into the chair across from him. Her mind was racing, thoughts crashing into each other like bumper cars. She had a crime lord's son in her apartment. She had lied to his men. In any version of reality she could imagine, this ended badly for her. "Why did you run?" she asked. Not because the answer would change anything, because she needed to understand. Nico looked up. His eyes were wet, but he didn't cry. The discipline again, that eerie, trained stillness. "I live in a house with 27 rooms. I have a tutor who comes 6 days a week. I have a driver who takes me everywhere. I have guards who stand outside my door at night." He swallowed. "I don't have any friends. I've never been to a real school. I've never been to a park without 3 men standing around the edges watching. I've never been to a birthday party. My father eats dinner with me maybe twice a month. The rest of the time it's just me and whoever's assigned to watch me." He paused, and something cracked in his voice. "I just wanted someone to see me, not guard me, not protect me. Just see me." Clara felt the words settle into her like stones sinking in water. She knew that feeling. She knew it intimately. The suffocating invisibility of being alone in a world full of people. After her mother died, she'd spent months in this apartment talking to walls, eating cereal over the sink, working double shifts, not because she needed the money, but because the silence at home was louder than anything she could bear. She understood this kid. That was the problem. Understanding made it impossible to walk away. "Okay," she said finally, "you can sleep here tonight. Tomorrow, we figure this out." Nico's lip trembled. It was the first truly childlike expression she'd seen from him, and it nearly broke her. She set up a makeshift bed on the couch with 2 blankets and a pillow that smelled like fabric softener. Nico curled up without a word, and within minutes his breathing steadied into sleep. Deep, total, the sleep of a child who'd been running on adrenaline and fear for days and had finally found something resembling safety. Clara didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen with the lights off, drinking instant coffee gone cold, staring at the wall. The rational voice in her head laid out the facts with clinical precision. She was harboring the son of a dangerous man. People were actively searching for this child. If they found him here, the best-case scenario was intimidation. The parole. The worst-case scenario she couldn't even let herself think about. She should call the police. She should call child services. She should do literally anything other than what she was doing. But she kept coming back to the same image. A boy sitting on a milk crate in a storage room, hands wrapped around a juice box, saying, "I just wanted someone to see me." She'd been invisible once, and nobody came. Around midnight, she checked on Nico one more time. He was deep asleep, one hand tucked under his cheek, the blanket pulled to his chin. In sleep, he looked exactly like what he was. A child. Not a kingpin's heir, not a runaway, just a boy who was cold and tired and afraid. Clara pulled the curtain aside and looked out at the street. The rain had stopped. The street was empty and slick with reflected light from the hardware store sign. Then she saw it. A black SUV, parked across the street, engine off, lights dark. It hadn't been there an hour ago. Clara's blood turned to ice. She stepped back from the window, letting the curtain fall, pressing herself against the wall. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she was sure it would wake the boy. She didn't look again. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit bottom, that by morning, the choice of what to do would no longer be hers to make. Clara didn't move from the wall for a long time. She stood with her back pressed flat against the plaster, 3 feet from the window, breathing through her nose in slow, controlled pulls that weren't slow or controlled at all. Her hands were fists at her sides. The apartment was dark, except for the faint orange bleed of the streetlight through the curtain seam, and in that half-dark she could hear everything. The hiss of water in the pipes, the groan of the building settling, Nico's steady breathing from the couch. She made herself count to 30 before she looked again. She peeled the curtain back half an inch. The SUV was still there. Engine off, lights dark, parked at the curb directly across from the hardware store entrance. The tinted windows gave back nothing. It could have been empty. It wasn't empty. She knew it wasn't empty the same way you know a dog is watching you before you see it. Something in the air changed, some pressure that the rational mind couldn't name, but the body registered as threat. Clara let the curtain fall. She moved to the kitchen, staying low out of habit, even though the angle made it impossible for anyone in the street to see through her second-floor windows. She sat on the floor with her back against the cabinets, knees pulled up, staring at the dark ceiling. The linoleum was cold through her jeans. She noticed that. She noticed everything that wasn't the central problem because the central problem was too large to look at directly. There was a dangerous man's child asleep on her couch. There were dangerous men parked outside her building. She had lied to them 6 hours ago, and they'd come back anyway, which meant either they already knew she was lying or they'd been thorough enough to check everywhere in a 20-mile radius, and hers was just the next box to tick. Neither option was good. She thought about calling 911. She turned it over carefully, looking for the angle that made it work. If she called the police, they came. They found Nico. They returned him to his father. That sounded like resolution until she remembered that Salvatore De Luca's organization reportedly had people inside 3 county sheriff's departments. She'd heard that once, drunk guy at the bar after a long shift, the kind of thing you dismiss as paranoid ranting. Right now, it didn't sound like paranoid ranting. Right now, it sounded like something she should have paid more attention to. She thought about waking Nico and running, getting in her car, the 2009 Civic with the cracked windshield that had been making a sound like a dying animal since August, and driving somewhere. Anywhere. How far could she get before they followed? How long before a woman in a junker Civic with a well-dressed 8-year-old got pulled over, got noticed, got found? She sat on the kitchen floor and thought herself in circles until the ceiling began to lighten from black to gray, and she realized she'd been sitting there for 5 hours. Nico woke at 7 without an alarm. Clara heard the couch creak and the soft sound of his feet on the floor, and she stood up from the kitchen with the specific physical difficulty of someone who'd spent a night on linoleum. Her lower back screamed. She ignored it. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. His hair was tangled, the expensive jacket wrinkled beyond recovery, but his eyes were clear and alert. Whatever sleep had done for him, it had been profound. He looked at her, at the position she'd clearly been in for hours, at the dark circles that had hardened under her eyes, and something moved across his face that might have been guilt. "They're outside," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked at him. "Yeah. Black SUV?" "Across the street." He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a thing they were afraid of gets confirmed. He walked to the window before she could stop him, and she grabbed his arm. "Don't." He stopped, looked at her hand on his arm. She let go. "Sorry," she said. "It's okay." He moved away from the window on his own. "They're not going to do anything in public. My father's rules, no scenes, no noise." That's reassuring. "I'm not trying to reassure you. I'm just telling you how it works." Clara rubbed her face with both hands. The skin felt loose, sandpapered, wrong. She needed coffee. She needed 8 hours of sleep and a different life. She filled the kettle because it was the only thing she could do right now that made sense. "Nico, I've been up all night trying to figure a way out of this that doesn't end badly. I can't find one." He sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him in that deliberate way she'd started to recognize, the gesture of a child taught to appear composed when he wasn't. "I know. You've run before. What happened?" "The first time they found me in 3 hours. I was at a McDonald's 2 towns over. The second time I made it 4 days. I was smarter about it. Didn't use any of the cards my father gave me. Paid cash for everything." He paused. "Then I ran out of cash. That's when I made a mistake." "What mistake?" "I called my tutor, Dr. Hensley. I thought he was different. Safe." His jaw tightened. "He called my father before we'd finished talking." Clara poured hot water over instant coffee, watching the granules dissolve. "And this time I didn't call anyone. I didn't use any money. I just walked." He looked at his hands. "I should have known it wouldn't work." "Why'd you do it again if you knew it wouldn't work?" The question landed in the kitchen and sat there. Nico didn't answer immediately. Clara turned around and leaned against the counter, holding her mug in both hands, waiting. She'd learned in 8 years of waitressing that silence made people fill space, and what they filled it with was usually the truth. "Because staying felt worse than getting caught," he finally said. Clara drank her coffee. It was terrible. She drank it anyway. "What does your father do when they bring you back?" "He sits with me, in his study. He has this chair, leather, behind this huge desk. And he sits in it and he looks at me and he asks me why. Every time. Why did you run, Nico? What are you missing? What do you need?" And every time I try to explain it, the words come out wrong, like I'm speaking a language and he's hearing a different one. He stopped. And then nothing changes. Clara set her mug down. "He loves you." "I know he does." Nico said it without warmth, without comfort, just as a fact. "That's the worst part. He loves me so much he built a cage around me and called it a house." The morning pushed on. Clara called Earl and told him she was sick, which was close enough to true. She heard the skepticism in his voice. She hadn't called in sick in 14 months. But he grumbled and hung up, which was as close to sympathy as Earl got. She fixed Nico scrambled eggs and toast. She made a second cup of terrible coffee. They sat at the kitchen table and she tried to think while he ate with that same focused mechanical concentration. At 9:30, someone knocked on her door. Not the downstairs entrance. Her door. The apartment door at the top of the back stairs. Clara and Nico both went completely still at the same moment. She held up one hand. "Stay." And he nodded, already reading the situation faster than a child should have to. She crossed the living room in her socks, avoiding the board that creaked near the TV stand, and put her eye to the peephole. The man on the other side of her door was not one of the two from the diner. This one was different, taller, leaner. He stood back from the door at a polite distance, hands visible at his sides, wearing a charcoal wool coat that was better than anything Clara had ever owned. His face was sharp-featured, controlled, the kind of face that had decided to be unreadable and kept to that decision. He was somewhere between 35 and 40, dark hair going gray at the temples. He was looking directly at the peephole as if he knew exactly where it was. Clara's stomach nodded. He knocked again. 3 knocks. Measured. Patient. "Ms. Bennett," he said. His voice was calm, educated, carrying through the door without effort. "My name is Damien Russo. I'd like to speak with you. I'm not here to threaten you, and I'm not going to. I have no interest in scaring you. I just want to talk." Silence. "I know Nico is inside. I've known since 11 o'clock last night. If I wanted to take him without talking to you, I could have done that while you were asleep. I didn't, which should tell you something about why I'm here." Clara pressed her back against the wall beside the door. Her throat was dry. "I'll wait," Damien Russo said. And from the sound of it, he meant it. Nico appeared at her elbow. She startled. He'd crossed the room silently, and now he stood at her shoulder, looking at the door. And on his face was something she hadn't seen before. Not fear. Something more complicated than fear. "Damien," Nico said quietly. Clara looked at him. "You know him?" "He runs operations for my father. Has since before I was born." He paused. "He's the only one of my father's people I've ever trusted." "That's a very low bar." "I know, but he means it. He won't lie to you." Nico looked up at her. "He's never lied to me." Clara stood there in the narrow entry of her apartment, caught between the door and the boy, and made a calculation that was really just her body moving before her mind agreed. She unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. Damien Russo didn't move forward. He stayed where he was, hands at his sides, and let her look at him. She looked. He let her. "May I come in?" he asked. Clara stepped aside. He entered without looking around the apartment the way most people would, cataloging it, assessing it. He looked only at Nico. The boy held still. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it. A history. A complicated, fraught, genuine history. "You look awful," Damien told the boy. "I know," Nico said. "Your father hasn't slept." Something flickered in Nico's face. He looked away. "He has people for that. He has people for everything except this." Damien let that sit, then he turned to Clara. He studied her with the same directness he'd given the peephole. Not rude, not aggressive, but completely without pretense. "Miss Bennett? Clara, what you did yesterday, lying to my men, that took nerve." "It was stupid," Clara said. "I know that." "It was both. They reported back that you seemed too composed, too deliberate, that you looked at the photograph for exactly the right amount of time." He tilted his head slightly. "They said you seemed like a woman who was calculating rather than remembering. There's a difference if you know what to look for. And you know what to look for." "I've been doing this a long time." He said it without pride, just fact. "The point is, you knew who they were, and you covered for a child you'd known for less than a day. That's either very brave or very unwise, and right now I'm trying to determine which." "Can it be both?" Something changed in his expression, not a smile, more like the acknowledgement of one. "Yes, it can." He clasped his hands in front of him. "I need to tell you some things, and I need you to listen without deciding what you think until I'm finished. Can you do that?" Clara crossed her arms. "Talk." Damien spoke for 12 minutes. He didn't dramatize, he didn't soften, and he didn't waste words. He explained, with the clinical precision of a man reporting facts to a superior, that Salvatore De Luca had not slept more than 2 hours since Nico disappeared, that the search operation he'd deployed covered 4 counties, involved 46 people, and had burned through more resources in 3 days than most small businesses generate in a year. That Salvatore De Luca was a dangerous man, but he was first and most essentially a father, and the two things lived inside him in constant, terrible conflict. He explained that Nico's previous escapes had each provoked the same response: an exhausting, expensive, emotionally destroying search followed by a return to normalcy that solved nothing because the actual problem was never addressed. He explained that the actual problem was loneliness. "He told you that?" Clara asked. "He didn't have to. I've watched that child for 8 years. I know what a lonely kid looks like." He said it flatly, without sentiment. "He looks exactly like Nico." Clara looked at Nico, who was standing by the kitchen doorway, not looking at either of them. "So what do you want?" she asked Damien. "Why are you here talking to me instead of just taking him?" "Because I've watched my employer make the same mistake 3 times now. Grab the boy, bring him home, promise things will change, and then slowly revert to exactly the way things were because he doesn't know any other way to be. And the boy runs again. Damien's voice didn't change. This time I want it to be different. And for it to be different, I need Nico to go back because he chose to, not because we dragged him, not because we ran out of options. He paused, and I think he'll do that if she asks him to. He was looking at Clara when he said it. Clara felt the weight of it land on her. She hadn't asked for this. She'd taken out the trash and heard breathing and made a decision she thought was simple. It had turned out to be the most complicated thing she'd ever done. She turned to Nico. "You heard that," she said. He was still looking at the floor. "Yeah." "Do you want to go back?" A long pause. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street. "I want things to be different," Nico said. "Not the same. Different." "Is that possible?" Clara asked Damien. The man was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, there was something underneath the flatness that she hadn't heard before. "I think it requires someone holding Salvatore accountable to it. Someone from outside his organization who he can't intimidate or fire or make disappear." "Like who?" Damien looked at her steadily. "Like the woman who hid his son from 46 of his people for 22 hours and looked his most experienced investigator in the face and lied clean." The silence stretched. Clara laughed. "It came out wrong. It shied too sharp, too short." The laugh of someone who's recognized that the universe is making a joke at her expense. "You want me to come with him, to the estate. I want you to bring him, on your terms, voluntarily, with Nico at your side and my word that you will not be harmed, threatened, coerced, or held." Damien reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the kitchen table. Just a phone number, no name. "I'll give you until noon to decide. After that, I can't guarantee the men outside won't do something I'd prefer they didn't." He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to her. "For what it's worth, Ms. Bennett, what you did for that boy, you could have called the police. You could have turned him away. You chose a third option that put you at significant personal risk for no reason except that he was cold and hungry and scared." He didn't turn around. "That kind of person is rare in my experience. I'd hate to see you destroyed by circumstances you stepped into out of decency." He left. The door swung shut behind him. Clara and Nico stood in the apartment. The silence was different from before. Heavier. "He meant it," Nico said, "about keeping you safe." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen him not mean things. I know the difference." He looked at her. "He's never once said something to me that wasn't true." Clara picked up the card from the table. Just numbers. No other information. She turned it over. Blank. "If I take you back," she said slowly, "your father is going to look at me. He's going to want to know everything about how this happened, who I am, where I live, where I work." "He already knows all of that," Nico said. "He knew by yesterday afternoon." Clara closed her eyes. "Of course he did." "He's not going to hurt you," Nico said, and then quieter. "He's not that kind of man." "What kind of man is he?" Nico thought about it, really thought about it, with the particular seriousness of a child who'd been watching adults his entire life from behind glass. "He's the kind of man who does terrible things and tells himself they're necessary. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. But he doesn't hurt people who don't enter his world by choice." "I didn't enter his world by choice." "No, but he'll see it that way anyway, that you found me, hid me, protected me. In his logic," Nico hesitated. "In his logic, that makes you someone who was loyal to him before you ever met him. He values loyalty more than anything." Clara set the card down. She looked at the window. The November light was flat and cold, painting everything the same exhausted gray. She thought about Maple House. She thought about the electric bill in her apron. She thought about the life she had here. Small, difficult, invisible, hers. Then she thought about what happened to people who got noticed by organizations like Salvatore De Luca's, and then tried to go back to being small and invisible. The choice had already been made for her. She could see that now. The moment she crouched behind that dumpster and looked into those dark, terrified eyes, the trajectory had been set. She'd just been too tired and too human to see it. She picked up the card. "Get your jacket," she said. Nico was already moving. She called the number at 11:47. Damien answered on the second ring. She gave him one condition. She drove her own car, with Nico, and Damien rode ahead of her, not behind. She wasn't going to be herded. She was going to make the choice, and the choice was going to look like a choice, or she wasn't doing it. Damien agreed without hesitation. She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. They left the apartment at 12:15. Clara carried nothing but her keys and her phone. Nico walked beside her down the back stairs with the quiet, careful steps of a child who'd learned to move through spaces without leaving traces. When they came out to the alley, the black SUV from across the street had moved and was idling at the entrance, Damien in the passenger seat, the driver she didn't recognize behind the wheel. Clara's Civic was parked at the far end of the alley. She unlocked it, and Nico got in on the passenger side without being told. She started the engine. The sound it made was not reassuring. She backed out, fell in behind the SUV, and followed it through Ashridge Hollow to the on-ramp for the turnpike, heading east toward Pittsburgh. They drove in silence for 20 minutes. The town disappeared in her rearview mirror. The landscape opened up into the gray roll of rural Pennsylvania, stripped trees and brown fields, and the occasional farmhouse set back from the highway like a face turned away. "Clara," Nico said. She kept her eyes on the road. "Yeah. Whatever happens today," he stopped, started again. "Thank you for the pancakes, and the blanket, and for lying to those men." Clara's hands tightened on the wheel. She said nothing for a moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said finally. "I haven't gotten you home safe." "I know, but—" He looked out his window at the passing fields. "Nobody's ever done that for me before. Hidden me. Not because I belong to them. Just because." Clara opened her mouth and closed it again. There was nothing to say to that. Not because there wasn't a response, but because sometimes the only decent thing you could do with something true and painful was let it sit in the air between two people without trying to solve it. The SUV ahead of her signaled and took an exit she didn't recognize. She followed. The road narrowed, trees thickened on both sides, and then, around a long curving bend, through the bare November trees, she saw it. Iron gates, 12 feet high. A wall that stretched both directions into the tree line, built from stone that looked like it had been there for decades. Security cameras positioned along the wall's crown, angled down. A guardhouse at the gate with two men who stood straighter when the SUV approached. Beyond the gates, a long paved drive curved through manicured grounds toward a house that was not a house. It was something else entirely, set. 4 stories, pale limestone, a structure that communicated without apology that the person inside it had decided the ordinary rules of the world did not apply to him. The gates opened. The SUV rolled through. Clara sat at the entrance, engine running, hands on the wheel. The guards were looking at her car. One of them was already on a radio. Nico put his hand on her arm. "It's going to be okay," he said. It was the first time he'd offered her reassurance instead of the other way around. She looked at him, this strange, composed, lonely little boy who had spent 2 days hiding behind dumpsters and under bridges to escape a palace. And she felt something lock into place inside her chest. Not bravery, not stupidity. Something quieter than either. She drove through the gates. She was still driving, still following the SUV up the long curved drive, when she noticed the second gate. Interior, set back from the first, electronically controlled. She watched it swing shut behind her car in the rearview mirror with a sound she felt more than heard. She was inside now. There was no question about what that meant. Outside and inside were different categories, and she had just moved from one to the other, and the gate had closed. Then the front doors of the mansion opened, and a man appeared at the top of the stone steps, and even from 50 yards away, even through a windshield, even after a sleepless night and hours of fear, Clara felt him, tall, silver-haired, still as stone, looking down at the car with an expression she couldn't read from this distance, but that made the air in the Civic suddenly feel thinner. Salvatore De Luca. The man whose son was sitting in the passenger seat of her 2009 Civic with the cracked windshield, looking at his father through the glass with an expression that was equal parts dread and longing. Clara stopped the car, cut the engine. The silence was absolute. She had no plan. She had no leverage. She had no legal standing, no connections, no safety net. She was a waitress from a diner in a town nobody remembered, sitting in a falling-apart car in front of a fortress, about to face a man who could make people disappear without Clara got out of the car. She didn't think about it. Thinking had stopped being useful somewhere around mile marker 47 on the turnpike, and the body had taken over with its own blunt logic. Feet on gravel, door pushed shut, cold air against her face. The crunch of her shoes on the paved drive was the loudest sound in the world. Nico got out on his side. He moved around the front of the car and stood beside her, shoulder almost touching her elbow, and together they looked up at the man on the steps. Salvatore De Luca came down slowly. Not with ceremony, not performing. He descended the way a man descends stairs in his own home when there is something at the bottom that matters more than appearances. His hands were in his coat pockets. His face, as he drew closer, resolved out of its distance into something more specific and more terrible than Clara had anticipated. He wasn't what she'd imagined. She'd built a picture in her mind over the past 24 hours. Cold, immaculate, the face of a man who'd made a career of not caring. What she saw instead was something cracked under the surface. Gray-eyed, yes. Still, yes. Commanding in the way that men who are used to rooms going quiet when they enter are always commanding. But around his eyes, the specific wreckage of someone who had not slept and had not allowed anyone to see that it was destroying him. He stopped 3 feet from Nico. Nico didn't move, didn't run to him, didn't flinch away. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked up at his father with that expression Clara had started to understand, the one that held too many things at once to call any of them by name. Salvatore looked at his son for a long time. His jaw worked once, that was all. Then he crouched, suddenly, without transition, dropping to one knee on the cold paved drive, and pulled Nico against his chest with both arms. Nico went rigid for exactly 1 second. Then something gave way in the boy. Clara heard it more than saw it, a sound from somewhere deep in his chest, small and raw. Not quite a sob, the sound of something that had been held too long releasing. His arms came up around his father's neck and he pressed his face into the wool coat, and Salvatore De Luca knelt on his own driveway holding his son and said nothing, nothing at all, just held him with the particular desperation of a man who'd spent 3 days understanding exactly what he stood to lose. Clara looked away. She stared at the middle distance, the iron gate, the tree line, the flat gray sky above the estate's roof line. She'd been wrong to assume she'd feel nothing. She felt too much. She felt the complicated, exhausted ache of someone who had wanted this to be simple and had found out over 48 hours that nothing about it was simple at all. Damien appeared at her left shoulder, noiseless. "Come inside," he said quietly. "You look like you're about to fall over." She followed him up the steps. Behind her, she could hear Salvatore speaking to his son in a low voice, too quiet to make out words. Just tone. Raw and stripped and entirely private. The interior of the mansion was not what the exterior promised. She'd expected palatial, marble, gilded, the self-conscious display of a man proving something. Instead, it was severe. Expensive in a way that didn't need to announce itself. Dark wood floors, walls the color of aged paper, rooms through open doorways that were large but sparsely furnished. Paintings that looked like they cost more than her apartment building. No warmth. Professionally organized, professionally maintained, the home of a man who'd prioritized the structure of a life without bothering much with what made a life livable. Damien brought her to a sitting room off the main hallway. A fire burned in a stone fireplace, actual fire, which was the first warm thing she'd encountered in the house. She sat on the edge of a leather chair and held her hands toward the heat without caring how it looked. Damien set a cup of coffee in front of her. Real coffee, not instant, which under any other circumstance she would have appreciated more. She drank it and stared at the fire and felt the night she'd spent on the kitchen floor settling into her spine like concrete. 20 minutes passed, maybe more. Then the door opened and Salvatore De Luca walked in alone. He'd composed himself. The crack she'd seen outside was sealed again, and what replaced it was the face his world was built on. Controlled, deliberate, leaving nothing readable on the surface. He sat in the chair across from her without asking permission. He was the kind of man who didn't need to ask permission in any room he occupied. He looked at her. Clara looked back. "Damien told me what you did," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not a powerful voice, a precise one, each word placed with care. "He told me about the diner. about your apartment, about the men you lied to." "I didn't plan any of it," Clara said. "I know." He was still watching her. "That makes it more interesting, not less." He crossed one leg over the other. His hands rested in his lap, entirely still. "You should understand something. I'm going to offer you money. Enough to make whatever happened here worth your while. Enough to make certain you have no financial incentive to discuss this with anyone. That offer is coming regardless of what else we say." "I'm not going to discuss it with anyone." "I believe you. The money comes anyway." His eyes didn't change. "What I'd like to understand is the part before the money. The part where a woman who has no connection to me, no reason to involve herself, no protection whatsoever, takes a significant personal risk for my son. I want to understand the mechanism of that decision." Clara set down the coffee cup. He was cold. He was hungry. He was 8 years old, and he was terrified. A pause. "That's it?" "That's it." Salvatore studied her with an attention that was deeply uncomfortable, the kind that felt like it was looking for structural flaws. "Most people in your position would have called the police, filed a report, removed themselves from the situation entirely." "I know." "Why didn't you?" Clara thought about lying. Not a real lie, not a strategic one, just the softened version. Something palatable about instinct and compassion that would let her out of the room without exposing anything real. She looked at the fire instead and told him the truth. "My mother died when I was 17. After she was gone, I had a really bad couple of years. Not dramatic bad, just quiet bad. The kind where you're in trouble, but it doesn't look like trouble from the outside, so nobody stops. Nobody checks. Nobody looks twice at the girl wiping tables in the diner. She's fine. She's managing." She paused. "I looked at your son behind that dumpster, and I saw a kid in the quiet bad kind of trouble. And I knew if I walked away, I'd have to live with that." The room was very still. Salvatore De Luca looked at her for a long time without speaking. Something had shifted in his expression. Not soften, that wasn't the word, but altered. Like a lens that had been adjusted by a single degree. "My son told me," he said finally, "that you fed him pancakes. Earl makes good pancakes. He told me you sat on the wet ground in the rain so he wouldn't feel cornered." Clara said nothing. "He told me," Salvatore continued, and now there was something in his voice she hadn't heard yet, a roughness that cost him something to allow. "That you asked him his name, that you waited for him to give it, that you didn't take it." The fire cracked. A log shifted. "He said no one does that," Salvatore said. "He said no one waits." Clara felt her throat tighten. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm to keep her face steady. This was not the moment to fall apart in front of this man. "I'll take the money," she said. "Not because I want it, but because pretending I don't need it would be stupid. But that's not why I did it." "I know why you did it." He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, elbows on knees, and for a moment the CEO posture fell away entirely, and what sat across from her was just a man who'd been taken apart by 3 days of fear. "I'm trying to understand it because I need to." He stopped. "I've built everything I have, every piece of it, and I don't know how to build what you did in an alley behind a diner." Clara looked at him. "It wasn't built. That's the point." A long silence. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and something changed in his face, a rapid professional hardening, the personal conversation sealing itself away. He stood up. "Excuse me." He stepped out of the room, and Clara heard his voice in the hallway, low and controlled. The same voice, but entirely different. Command mode. She heard him issue 3 short instructions and then silence, and when he came back in, the man who'd been leaning forward with something human on his face was replaced by the one she'd seen descending the steps. "There's a room prepared for you," he said. "Damien will take you to it. You should sleep." "I should go home." "You'll go home when I'm certain it's safe. That's not a threat. That's information." He stopped at the door. "I have a situation that requires my attention. We'll speak again this evening." He was gone before she could answer. Damien materialized from somewhere, as he seemed to do, and showed her to a guest room on the 2nd floor that was larger than her entire apartment. She didn't look at any of it. She sat on the edge of the bed, set her phone alarm for 3 hours, lay down on top of the covers with her jacket still on, and was asleep before the thought finished forming. She woke at 2:17 to her alarm and to the muffled sound of raised voices somewhere below. She sat up, pushed the hair out of her face, listened. She couldn't make out words. Just register. 2 voices, one of them Salvatore's, clipped and controlled. The other she didn't recognize. The exchange lasted perhaps 90 seconds, and then there was silence, abrupt and total, the kind that didn't mean the conversation had concluded naturally. She splashed water on her face in the attached bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, dark under the eyes, pale everywhere else, the face of someone 3 decisions past where they should have stopped, and went out into the hallway. Damien was at the end of the corridor near the top of the stairs, on his phone. He saw her and held up one finger. She waited. He finished the call and walked toward her. "What's happening?" Clara asked. "There's been a development," he said. "Come with me." She followed him down the main stairs and along a corridor she hadn't been in before, to a room near the back of the house. A study, paneled walls, the enormous desk Nico had described. Salvatore was standing at the window, his back to the room, hands clasped behind him. Nico was in a chair against the wall, and beside him, perched on the edge of a settee, was a man Clara didn't recognize. Mid-40s, broad, with the specific softness of someone who'd once been built and had let it go to seed. His face was ordinary enough to be designed that way, forgettable on purpose. He wore a suit that was too new, too sharp, and he looked at Clara when she entered with a kind of calm interest that didn't belong to the situation. "Ms. Bennett," Salvatore said without turning from the window. "Do you know who this is?" "No." "His name is Vincent Carrel. He's an investigator." A pause. "He works for the Mancini family." Clara felt the name land without knowing all of what it meant. She knew enough. She'd heard De Luca, she'd heard Mancini, in the same way she'd heard the names of countries at war, as abstract geography until you found yourself standing in the middle of one. "What does he want?" she asked. Salvatore turned from the window. His face was a flat iron. "He wants you." The room reorganized itself around that sentence. Clara stood very still. "Specifically," Salvatore continued, moving to his desk, "he wants your testimony that Nico was found in your possession without my knowledge, that you kept him against his will, that you intended to contact the Mancini organization to negotiate his return." He sat. He laid both palms flat on the desk. "He wants to use you to manufacture evidence that I cannot control my own family, that I am vulnerable." His eyes held hers. "He wants to use you as the first brick in a case that ends with me in federal custody and my organization split open like a fish." Clara's mouth was dry. "I didn't do any of that." "I know you didn't." "Then why?" "Because it doesn't matter what you did." Salvatore's voice was quiet, absolute. "It matters what can be made to look like what you did. And you walked into this house voluntarily, with no legal counsel, no witnesses who work for anyone but me, having already lied to federal." He stopped. His jaw tightened. He started again. "The 2 men in the diner, the men who showed you the photograph. They work for you," Clara said. "Your people. They work for me now." A pause that lasted too long. 3 months ago, 2 of them were on the Mancini payroll. The silence in the room was cavernous. Clara looked at Damien. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not guilty, not apologetic, just watching her absorb it the way a doctor watches a patient absorb a diagnosis. "You have moles," she said. "Had," Salvatore said. "Past tense, as of this morning." The way he said past tense didn't invite follow-up questions. "But the damage is done. Those men reported back to Mancini before they reported to me. Everything they observed, including you." Clara turned to Carrel. He was still sitting on the settee, hands folded, watching the room with the patient attention of a man who'd come to deliver a message and was waiting for the message to finish working. "What do you want from me?" Clara asked him directly. Carrel's expression didn't change. "A conversation. That's all at this stage. My employer is interested in Ms. Bennett's experience, her perspective on events." "She has no perspective you're entitled to," Salvatore said. "Respectfully, That's for Ms. Bennett to decide. Carell looked at Clara. You're not his employee. You're not his family. You're a private citizen who got caught in something she didn't choose. My employer would argue that you have the right to make decisions about your own situation without Mr. DeLuca's guidance. Clara looked at this man and understood exactly what was happening. The sophistication of it was nauseating. Not a threat. Not yet. An offer of exit dressed as concern for her autonomy. Here is a door, it said. And behind the door was a room that would destroy Salvatore DeLuca, and the price of using the door was being the instrument of that destruction, and none of it was her fault, and all of it would be on her. I'm not interested in a conversation, she said. Something moved in Carell's eyes. Very small. Not quite disappointment. More like recalibration. That's your right, he said. Of course. He stood, straightened his jacket, looked at Salvatore with the professional courtesy of two men who understood each other's positions completely. You know how to reach us. Salvatore said nothing. Damien escorted Carell out. The door closed. The study was very quiet. Nico was looking at his hands. Salvatore was looking at the middle distance above the desk. Clara stood near the door and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running for days and has just been told the terrain extends further than any map showed. He'll be back, she said. Yes. With more than a conversation. Yes. So what do we do? Salvatore looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen yet. Not the controlled power, not the father's grief, not the performance of authority. Something underneath all of it. Something that looked almost like the beginning of respect. I need to make some calls, he said. Damien will stay with you. Do not leave the house. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. Clara sat in the chair Nico had vacated. The boy crossed the room and sat on the floor beside her, his back against the chair leg, and she didn't say anything about it. They sat together in the study while outside the windows the afternoon light thinned and grayed, and Clara stared at the paneled walls and thought about all the ways a person could take out the trash on an ordinary Tuesday morning and end up inside a story they had absolutely no business being in. I'm sorry, Nico said. Clara looked down at him. For what? For all of it. I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would. He stopped. I just wanted pancakes. Despite everything, despite the fear sitting in her chest like swallowed gravel, Clara felt something inside her chest break open in a way that wasn't entirely terrible. Yeah, she said. Me too, kid. 3 hours later, Damien came for her. He walked her to a different room, a smaller study off the library, no windows, 2 chairs facing each other and a small table with a lamp. He sat her down and then he sat across from her and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and for the first time since she'd opened her apartment door to him that morning, he looked like a man who was choosing his words very carefully because the wrong ones would cause damage he couldn't repair. I need to tell you something, he said, about what Carell said, about the men who came to your diner. Clara waited. When I said they were on the Mancini payroll 3 months ago, he stopped. That's true, but it's not complete. He held her gaze with the precision of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine what came after them. They were placed in Salvatore's organization by Mancini 8 months ago, deep cover. Their specific assignment was to identify points of vulnerability. Nico, Clara said. Nico, Damien confirmed. This wasn't opportunistic. Mancini didn't find out about Nico's disappearance and decide to use it. They've been building toward using it for the better part of a year. He paused. They had surveillance on Ashridge Hollow within 6 hours of Nico going missing, before we did. Clara felt cold. They were watching your diner, she said slowly, not following Nico. Already watching the diner. We believe so, yes. Why? Why my diner? Damien's jaw tightened in the way she'd learned to read as the tell of a man who was about to say something he'd prefer not to say. Because 6 months ago, one of Salvatore's men made a casual remark in the wrong company about Ashridge Hollow, about a contact there. The remark was intercepted. What contact? Clara asked. I've never had anything to do with any of this. Damien was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. Clara's stomach dropped. Who's the contact? She asked. Her voice was flat now. She could hear it herself, the way it had emptied out because some part of her had already started adding the numbers. Damien looked at her. "His name is Earl Gavin," he said. "He owns a diner in Ashridge Hollow. He has for 11 years. Before that, he worked for Salvatore De Luca in an administrative capacity for 6 years. When he retired from that work, Salvatore set him up. The diner. The building. A clean new life." The room tilted. Clara sat in her chair and listened to the information rearrange everything she understood about the past 4 years of her life. Earl. Earl who hired her 2 months after she lost her mother. Earl with his thermos and his silences, and the way he'd looked at her with something she'd always read as gruff pity, but which was now resolving horribly into something else entirely. Earl who had managed the diner's finances, who knew every regular, who could have told someone everything there was to know about Clara Bennett without trying. "He's been reporting to someone," she said. "We believe he reported to Mancini's people, not intentionally." Damien's voice was careful. "We believe he was compromised. His finances—" He stopped. "He owes money to people who are connected to the Mancini network, not wisely borrowed money, the kind of debt that comes with conditions." So Mancini had someone inside the diner. Clara heard her own voice from a slight distance. "And when Nico showed up, and I hit him, Mancini knew within hours. Through Earl." "Yes." "And those men who came in with the photograph were there to confirm and to record whatever they could about you, your face, your behavior, your responses." He paused. "You lied to them very well, but they still got what they came for." Clara pressed her hands flat on her thighs. The fabric of her jeans was rough against her palms, and she focused on that texture, that physical fact, because it was the only thing in the room that wasn't in motion. "So when I walked into this house today," she said slowly, "I didn't just bring Nico home. I brought Mancini exactly what they needed." Damien said nothing. "They have my face, my story, my presence in this house. They have everything they need to build whatever case they want to build." She looked at him. "And Carell being here, that wasn't an accident. That was the delivery." "Yes." "He wasn't asking me to cooperate. He was showing me he could." "Yes." Clara sat back in her chair. The lamp on the small table put a warm circle of light in the dark room, and outside that circle everything was shadow. She felt very clearly and precisely the dimensions of what she was inside. Not just the house. The situation, the architecture of it, which had been built carefully over months by people who were very good at their work, and which had included her as a component without her knowledge. She had walked into it out of decency. Decency. The thing that had made her crouch behind a dumpster in the rain and offer pancakes to a scared boy. The thing that had kept her up all night on a kitchen floor trying to do right by a child she didn't know. The thing that had driven her through iron gates into a fortress on the word of a man she'd met 4 hours earlier. Her decency had been a lever. Someone had seen it coming from 6 months away and built a machine around it and waited. "What happens now?" she asked. Damien's expression did something complicated, not quite helpless. That wasn't a word that fit him, but something at the edge of it. "Salvatore is addressing the immediate security situation, the men who were compromised, the breach." "That's not what I asked." "I know." He met her eyes. "What happens to you depends on what Mancini decides to do with what they have. If they use it, if they move to turn it into formal testimony or leverage, then your position becomes very complicated. Define complicated. You become either an asset or an obstacle. If you cooperate with them, you're an asset. If you refuse, you're an obstacle. Neither position—" He stopped. "Neither position is safe," Clara finished. "No." Clara looked at the lamp, the warm circle of light. She thought about Ashridge Hollow, the diner, the electric bill in her apron, the 2009 Civic with the cracked windshield and the sound like a dying animal, the apartment above the hardware store with the radiator that only worked on one side. The life she had left, somewhere behind an iron gate, was already gone. She understood that now with a clarity that felt like stepping off something. Whatever version of herself had taken out the trash Tuesday morning and heard breathing behind a dumpster, that version didn't have a way back to where she'd started. She had done a simple, decent thing, and she was going to have to become something entirely different to survive it. The door opened. Salvatore De Luca stood in the frame, and behind him in the hallway, Clara could see two men she didn't recognize, armed, moving with purpose toward the back of the house. His face was set, hard, the face of a man who'd just received news that required an answer he already knew how to give. "We have a problem," he said. Clara looked at him from her chair. "Which one?" "Carell didn't leave the property." "A beat. He's in the east wing. He went in through a service entrance. He has two men with him." Salvatore's eyes were on her, direct and absolute. "They're not here for a conversation anymore." Clara stood up from the chair. Her legs were steady. She wasn't sure when that had happened, when the fear had compressed down into something flat and cold and usable. But it had. And she was standing, and she looked at the man in the doorway who commanded an empire, and who was looking back at her with an expression that said clearly that the next move in this room was hers to make. "Where's Nico?" she asked. "Secured. Safe." "Then tell me what you need me to do," Clara said. Salvatore looked at her for exactly 1 second, the kind of look that measured a person against a situation and decided whether they fit. Whatever he found, he didn't argue with it. "Stay close to Damien. Don't move without him. Don't open doors. Don't try to help." He paused. "If Nico calls for you, don't answer. That's how they'll use him." Clara's jaw tightened. "They'd use a child as bait. They've been planning this for 8 months. They'll use whatever works." He turned to the hallway. Damien. Damien was already moving. The house changed around her in the next 60 seconds in ways she felt before she understood. The ambient sound of a large staffed estate, the distant footsteps, the mechanical hum of a building maintained by invisible labor, went quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, the quiet of people who knew their positions and had taken them. Through the hallway window, she caught the movement of men crossing the grounds in the darkening afternoon, shadows among shadows, purposeful and silent. Damien took her arm, not roughly, and moved her to the interior of the house, away from windows. The corridor they moved through was narrow and dark, the service passage behind the main hall, and it smelled of old wood and something metallic that she didn't want to identify. "East wing," she said quietly, keeping pace with him. "How did he get through?" "Service entrance on the north side. The cameras on that section went down 40 minutes ago." His voice was controlled and fast. "Which means they planned it. Which means they had someone with access to our system. Another inside man. Or the same inside man. Different assignment." He stopped at an intersection in the corridor, listened, moved right. "We have 12 people on the interior. Carell brought 2, but we don't know if there are more outside." "You don't know." "We're working on it." Clara followed him and noted her own body with a kind of detached surveillance. Her pulse was high but not disabling. Her hands were cold. Her breathing was slightly too shallow, and she corrected it deliberately, pressing air down into her lungs. She was afraid, but fear had reorganized itself into something functional, a background engine running parallel to the part of her that was still thinking. They reached a room she hadn't been in. Small, no windows, a monitoring station of some kind. 3 screens on a desk showing camera feeds from around the property. One screen was static on the upper left, the north service entrance, the blank eye of a dead camera. The others showed grounds, corridors, the gatehouse. A man sat at the desk who turned when they entered. Young, sharp-faced, headset around his neck. "East corridor, second floor," he said to Damien without preamble. 3 heat signatures. They're moving toward the library. "Nico's location?" Damien asked. "3rd floor, secured room, 2 men outside the door. He's contained." "Keep him contained." Damien turned to Clara. "Stay here." "No. Ms. Bennett, if they're going to the library and Nico is on the 3rd floor, they're not going for Nico. They're going for the study. The documents." She'd been in this house for 6 hours, and she'd already understood its geography from walking it with Damien. The library connected to the main study on the 2nd floor, Salvatore's desk. Whatever was in or on that desk. "What's in that study that they want?" Damien looked at her, a short, evaluating look. "Records. Operational records that Salvatore keeps in physical form because physical form can't be hacked. If Mancini gets those records, They don't need my testimony. They have everything. Yes. Then stop them from getting to the study. That's the actual problem. I'm aware of the actual problem. Then go. She looked at the young man at the screens. I'll stay here with him. I won't move. Damien looked at her for one more second. Then he was gone. The door swinging shut behind him, and Clara was alone in the monitor room with the young man who was already back at his screens, his jaw working nervously, his hands moving between a keyboard and a radio on the desk. She stood behind him and watched the screens. The feeds that still worked showed corridors, patches of lawn under floodlights that had come on as dark settled outside. The main gate where two guards stood at elevated attention. One camera showed a slice of the second-floor hallway outside the library. The angle was partial, cutting off at the door itself, showing only the approach. Clara watched it and counted her heartbeats and felt the specific quality of a waiting she'd never had to practice before. The young man's radio burst. A short, clipped exchange. She caught fragments. East wing, second floor, contact. On the corridor camera, she saw movement at the edge of the frame. One of Salvatore's men moving fast along the wall. Then nothing. Then the frame juddered. Not the camera, she realized, but something impacting the structure nearby. A physical vibration transmitted through the building. What was that, she said? Door breach. East stairwell. The young man's voice was steady. He'd done this before. Clara envied that. The radio again. More fragments, faster now. She picked out Damien's voice. Short, precise. The voice of a man issuing directions while doing something with his hands. She couldn't make out words. The corridor camera flickered. Then the door to the monitor room opened. It wasn't Damien. The man who came through was one of Carell's. She knew it immediately, not from recognition, but from the way he moved, the particular directness of someone who'd found what they were looking for and was done being subtle about it. He was younger than Carell, broader, wearing dark clothes, and his eyes went from the young man at the desk to Clara in the half-second it took him to clear the doorway. He reached for her. Clara didn't think. She'd spent 14 years waiting tables, which meant 14 years of moving around people in tight spaces, reading bodies, anticipating trajectory. She stepped left and back, and his hand caught the air where her shoulder had been, and she grabbed the edge of the desk and put it between them. The young man at the desk stood up and said something that got cut off when the intruder shoved him sideways into the equipment, hard, and the radio skittered off the desk and hit the floor. Clara had the radio in her hand. She didn't know when she'd picked it up. The intruder was around the desk now, between her and the door, and the room was very small. Damien, she said into the radio. Her voice was even. She was distantly amazed by this. Static. The intruder took one step toward her and she threw the radio at his face. He got his arm up and deflected it, and in the half-second that bought her, she moved for the door behind him, going low, under his reach, and got her hand on the frame. He caught her jacket. The fabric went taut. She yanked forward and the jacket seam tore at the shoulder, and she was through the door and in the corridor and moving before she'd completed the thought. She ran. The corridor was dark, emergency lighting only, thin strips of pale light along the floor. She ran toward the main house because that was toward more people and away from the east wing, where Carol's men had come in. She could hear the intruder behind her. His footsteps, heavier, faster, closing. She hit the door to the main hall at full speed and it swung open into light. Salvatore was there. He was not alone. He was accompanied by two of his men, and he was moving toward the east corridor with an expression on his face that was no longer any kind of controlled. He saw Clara come through the door at speed and registered her torn jacket, and the man coming through 2 steps behind her in the same instant, and what happened in the next 4 seconds was fast and overwhelming and ended with Carell's man face down on the floor with 2 of Salvatore's people on him, and Clara against the wall with her hands pressed flat to the plaster, breathing. Salvatore stepped to her. He looked at her face, at the torn jacket. "Are you hurt?" "No." She pushed off the wall. "They went for the study. Damien went to stop them." "I know. Come with me." He was already moving. She went with him because standing still wasn't an option, and because something had shifted in the architecture of this night. She was inside it now, not adjacent to it, not a bystander who'd wandered in. She was inside, and the only direction that meant anything was forward. They took the main staircase to the second floor. At the top, two of Salvatore's men stood at the corridor junction. One of them was talking low and fast into a headset. He saw Salvatore and reported in rapid, compact sentences that Clara caught in pieces. Library door, secured. Carell, located. North corridor. "Where's Damien?" Salvatore asked. "He has Carell, study." A pause. "There's a problem." Salvatore's face didn't change, but something in his posture did. Clara had been reading people across diner counters for 8 years, and she saw it. The infinitesimal tightening across the shoulders, the shift of weight. What problem? Carell didn't come for the records. The man with the headset met Salvatore's eyes. "We found the second man. North stairwell, outside the third floor." The third floor. The secured room. Nico. Salvatore was moving before the sentence finished. Clara was right behind him, the two guards falling in on either flank, and they took the north stairwell at the kind of speed that leaves the rational mind slightly behind the body. She was aware of the steps under her feet, the iron rail cold under her hand, the sound of the building. Different now, charged, the sound of a house at war with itself. Third floor corridor, long, carpeted, the lights fully on up here. Two of Salvatore's men outside a door at the far end, both of them awake, both armed, both intact. Clara felt a fraction of the compression in her chest release, but Salvatore didn't slow down until he'd covered the length of the corridor and put his hand on the door himself and opened it. Nico was standing in the center of the room. He was unharmed. His eyes went to his father, then to Clara, with an expression that contained enormous relief and something harder. The face of a child who'd been locked in a room listening to sounds he couldn't interpret and had been forced to sit with his own fear because there was nothing else to do with it. Salvatore crossed the room in 4 strides and put both hands on his son's shoulders and looked at him with a thoroughness that was entirely physical, checking, cataloging. Nico endured it. "I'm fine," Nico said. "I'm fine, Dad." Salvatore's hands tightened on the boy's shoulders briefly and then released. He straightened. He turned to the guards at the door. "Who was in the north stairwell?" "Mancini man. We found him on the landing. He was trying to get a photo through the door gap." The guard hesitated. "Camera phone. We think he was trying to document Nico's location for the case," Clara said. Everyone looked at her. She was standing in the doorway, torn jacket, cold hands, and she could see the shape of it now, all of it, the whole mechanism Mancini had been building. They didn't actually want to grab him. They wanted to document him, to prove he was here, inside this house, under these conditions, to prove the isolation, the guards outside his door. She looked at Salvatore. In front of a court, that's not protection. That's a child being held in a locked room with armed men outside. The room was very quiet. Salvatore looked at her with those silver eyes and said nothing. "They're building a welfare case," Clara said. "Not a criminal case. Or both. They're going to argue that Nico isn't safe here, that he should be removed from your custody." She pressed. "That's why they wanted me. My testimony, an outsider's testimony, about the conditions I observed, a child locked in a room, unable to leave, surrounded by armed guards." She paused. "They weren't going to manufacture a story. They were going to let me tell the truth." The words landed in the room and stayed, because the truth was what it was. Salvatore's jaw worked. His face was stone, but the stone had hairline cracks in it, and they were spreading. He looked at his son who had run away twice, 3 times, who had hidden behind dumpsters in the rain to escape this house, and something crossed between them that Clara didn't have language for. "Dad," Nico said quietly. Salvatore looked away. Damien appeared in the doorway behind Clara. He was breathing harder than she'd ever seen him breathe, and there was a cut above his left eye that was bleeding freely down the side of his face, and he was holding his right arm slightly away from his body in a way that meant it had taken damage. He looked at the room, assessed everything in a second, and focused on Salvatore. "Carell is secured. His 2 men are secured. The one in the monitor room." He glanced at Clara. "Also secured." "The camera," Salvatore said. The phone. We have it. The images haven't been transmitted. The signal in this wing is blocked. Damien wiped blood from his eye with the back of his hand. But Salvatore, this isn't over. I know. Mancini knows the attempt failed. They'll know within the hour. What they do next. I know. Salvatore turned from the window. He looked at the room. His son, his lieutenant, the woman in the torn jacket standing in his doorway. And Clara saw the weight of it on him, the full, crushing, specific weight of a man who had built everything he had as armor and was only now understanding what the armor had cost. I need an hour, he said. Clear the room. The guards went. Damien went, casting one backward look at Clara that she read as stay close. She moved to follow them. Not you, Salvatore said. She stopped. He was looking at his son. Nico was looking back. The room was very small suddenly. Sit down, Salvatore said. Not to her, to Nico. The boy sat on the edge of the bed. His father pulled a chair from the corner, turned it around, and sat on it backward with his arms crossed over the top rail. An unstudied posture, uncharacteristic, something a man does when he's stopped performing and doesn't have a replacement ready. Tell me, Salvatore said to his son, tell me what you see when you look at this room. Nico looked around the room. It was a fine room by any standard, large, warm, well-furnished, everything a child could need. A room, Nico said carefully. What else? A door with men outside it. Salvatore's mouth pressed together. That's protection. I know. Then, I know it's protection. Nico's voice didn't rise. It had that terrible steadiness. I know everything you do is protection. I know why. I understand why. He stopped. I don't need a bigger room, Dad. I need to be outside the room. Clara stood at the edge of the doorway and felt like a witness at something enormously private and couldn't make herself leave. Outside the room is where they went tonight, Salvatore said. Outside the room is where Mancini sends men with cameras. I know that. You cannot... I know. Nico looked at his father and the adult quality behind his eyes, the quality that had been wrong and heartbreaking from the moment Clara first saw him behind the dumpster, was in full relief. But here's what I know that you don't. When I was behind that dumpster, in the rain, for 2 days, eating nothing, I was less scared than I am in this room, because in the rain I was choosing. He paused. Here, I'm just waiting. The silence between them was enormous. Salvatore looked at his son. He looked at him the way people look at things they've been carrying without understanding the weight, when the weight finally becomes visible. Then he looked at Clara. She met his eyes across the room. She'd been in this house for hours, and she'd run from a man twice her size, and she'd stood in corridors while the building shook, and she'd held herself together with the cheap wire of adrenaline and stubbornness. She was wrung out, torn at the shoulder, running on bad coffee and a 3-hour sleep. She had no leverage and no safety net, and her car was parked in this man's driveway, and she had nowhere to go that Mancini's people didn't already know about. She said the thing that was true. Not because it was strategic, because it was the only thing left. He's telling you exactly what he needs, she said to Salvatore. He's been telling you for years. You keep hearing the wrong part. Salvatore De Luca looked at the woman in the doorway for a long time. Then he said, What's the right part? Clara's throat was tight. He's not running from you. He's running towards something. There's a difference. She held his gaze. He wants to be yours. He just doesn't want that to be the only thing he is. The room held still for a beat that felt longer than it was. Salvatore turned back to his son. Something in the architecture of his face had changed. Not broken, not collapsed, but revised. Like a structure that has been rebuilt around a different load-bearing point. The school in the city, Salvatore said slowly. Damien mentioned it 6 months ago. I said no. Nico said nothing, waiting. I said no because... Salvatore stopped. His jaw worked. Because the security requirements were complicated. The security requirements are always complicated, Nico said. Yes. A pause. But complicated doesn't mean impossible. Another pause. Longer. It means I'd have to change how I do things. I know. I don't know how to do that. I know that too. Nico looked at his father. Maybe you could learn. Clara was looking at the window. Outside, the grounds were lit by floodlights, Salvatore's men moving across them in the cold night, and beyond the walls was the dark Pennsylvania landscape, anonymous and enormous. She was thinking about Mancini, about Carell, secured somewhere in this house, about the fact that the threat that had come through the East Wing tonight was the forward edge of something much larger and much more patient. She was thinking about Earl, about the diner, about 4 years of small kindnesses from a man she'd thought was just gruff and good-hearted, who had apparently been drowning in debt to people connected to a criminal organization, who had reported, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not, everything about her to people who had then used her like a piece on a board. She was thinking about the woman she'd been at 7 this morning, standing in the monitor room with a radio in her hand, and how different she was from the woman she'd been at 9:40 Tuesday morning taking out trash. The door behind her opened. Damien again, his eyes still bleeding, his right arm clearly damaged. He looked at Salvatore. "We need you downstairs. Carell is talking." Salvatore stood. He touched Nico once, briefly, on the top of the head, the gesture of a man who hadn't done it enough and knew it. And then he moved to the door. He stopped beside Clara on his way out. He didn't look at her. He looked at the wall, and his voice was very quiet, and what he said was not what she expected from a man like him. "I've had people work for me for 20 years who couldn't tell me what you just told me in 30 seconds. Then he was gone, and Damien was giving her a long look that said everything and nothing, and she was standing in a doorway with a torn jacket and shaking hands, and a child sitting on a bed in the room behind her who had started all of this by being cold and hungry and invisible. Downstairs, the sound of men in movement, urgent and low. Outside, the floodlit grounds and the iron walls. Somewhere in the house, Vincent Carell was talking, and whatever he was saying was going to determine what came next, and what came next was going to require something from Clara that she hadn't been asked for yet. She felt it building. She'd felt it since the diner, the shape of a demand that hadn't fully announced itself. She went downstairs. The main hall was bright, 4 of Salvatore's men flanking a door she hadn't been through. Damien intercepted her at the base of the stairs. "He's asking for you." "Carell?" "Yes." "Why?" Damien's expression was the flat, careful look of a man managing the distance between information and reaction. Because whatever play Mancini is running ends with your testimony or it doesn't run at all. You're not peripheral to this. You're the mechanism. He held her gaze. "Carell wants to make one more offer, in person, before Salvatore decides what happens to him." "And Salvatore is letting him?" "Salvatore wants to know what they're offering. So do I." Damien tilted his head slightly. "So should you." Clara looked at the guarded door. Through it, a man who'd been sent by people who had used her without her knowledge and had built a trap out of her decency. A man who would make an offer that would sound like escape and would be another kind of cage. She'd been afraid for 36 hours. She was still afraid. She was afraid the way you're afraid at the top of a structure when you look down and understand gravity personally, not as a concept, but as a force with your name on it. She went to the door. One of the guards opened it. The room beyond was a small parlor, sparsely furnished, a table, 4 chairs, a window with the curtains drawn. Carell sat at the table. His jacket was gone. There was a bruise forming along his jaw. He looked exactly as composed as he had in the study 6 hours ago, which under the circumstances was either impressive or insane. He looked at Clara when she came in. "Ms. Bennett," he said. Same voice, patient even. "Thank you for coming." Clara sat across from him. She did not look at the door. She put her hands on the table where he could see them, and she looked at Vincent Carell and she said, "Make it fast." He studied her. Not the evaluating look of the study, something different, something that might have been the first honest look he'd given her. "My employer's position is simple," he said. "We're not your enemy. We have no interest in your life, your safety, your finances. You were incidental to a much larger operation, and we regret that the incidental damage to you has been significant. He paused. My employer is prepared to guarantee your safety, relocate you, fund a new beginning, somewhere outside Pennsylvania, outside DeLuca's reach. In exchange for one recorded statement, your honest account of what you observed during your time in this house, the guarded room, the armed men, the conditions under which Nico DeLuca lives. He leaned forward very slightly. You wouldn't be lying. You'd be telling the truth, your truth. And the truth, your specific, honest, credible truth, is enough. Clara looked at her hands on the table. You'd use it to take him, she said. Nico, you'd use a custody proceeding to take him away from his father. We'd use it to establish grounds for a welfare intervention. What happens after? Don't. Her voice was sharp and he stopped. Don't manage the language with me. You'd take the boy and you'd use him. Carell was quiet for a moment. My employer would use the situation, yes, that's accurate. What happens to Nico? He'd be placed with, what happens to Nico? She looked at him, specifically. The child, not the legal situation, not the strategic position, the 8-year-old boy. What happens to him? Carell's composure showed its first crack. It was small, a slight tightening around the eyes, an adjustment of the hands. That would depend on, you don't know, Clara said. He didn't answer. You've been planning this for 8 months and you don't know what happens to the child. She held his gaze. Because he's not the point, is he? He was never the point. He's the lever. She felt something cold and absolute settle inside her. Same as me. The room was very still. I'm not going to give you a statement, Clara said. Carell looked at her. Ms. Bennett, consider your position carefully. Outside this house, Mancini's resources, I know what your resources are. She stood up. I know what my position is. I know that I walked into a situation I didn't choose and got used by everybody, including the people who were supposedly protecting me. She pushed the chair in. I'm not a lever. I'm a person. And I'm done being moved around by people who can't see the difference. She walked to the door. Behind her, Carell's voice came one last time, still patient, still even. This isn't going to go away, Ms. Bennett. Mancini doesn't accept this outcome. What comes next? I know, she said. She had her hand on the door. I'm still not going to do it. She opened the door and walked out into the hall, and Damien was there, and Salvatore was there, and the 2 guards, and the light that was too bright after the dim parlor, and she stood in all of it. And for one suspended moment, she felt the full weight of every decision she had made in the last 36 hours sitting on her chest like a physical thing. Then Salvatore said, Well? Clara looked at him. He made his offer, she said. I declined. Something moved across Salvatore DeLuca's face. She'd been in his house for hours, and she'd learned to read the small things. The jaw, the eyes, the set of his shoulders. What she saw now was not relief. It was more complicated than relief. What do you want? He asked her. She looked at him. Not money, he said. Not now. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking what you actually want, out of this. From me. His voice was stripped of everything. The authority, the performance, the careful management of impression. Tell me. Clara looked at this man. This dangerous, broken, armored, genuinely terrified father. And she knew exactly what she wanted, and it had nothing to do with money or relocation or the abstract safety that Carell had offered and that Salvatore could provide. She opened her mouth. The lights went out. All of them. The main hall, the corridor, the exterior floods visible through the window glass. Every light in the house. Total dark. Instant. Total. In the sudden blindness, Clara heard the sound that followed it. Not the guards moving, not Damien issuing orders. Those came a half-second later. The first sound, the one that filled the half-second of pure dark before anyone reacted, was the first sound in the dark was Nico's voice from the top of the stairs. Not a scream, not the panicked cry of a child who's been startled. Just his name, said once, into the black. Dad. With the specific stripped quality of a person who has learned that screaming doesn't bring help, and so has cut the sound down to its minimum viable form. Salvatore moved before Clara could track him. She heard him cross the hall floor, 4 strides, fast, certain, and then heard the stairs, and then Damien's hand found her arm in the dark and pulled her against the wall. "Don't move," Damien said. His voice was at her ear, very low. "Don't speak." She didn't. The dark was total. The kind of dark that only exists inside buildings, without windows or exit signs or the ambient leak of streetlight. She could hear breathing, her own, Damien's close beside her, the guards further out. She could hear movement in the upper hallway, Salvatore's footsteps. She could hear, below all of that, the distant sound of the estate's perimeter, wind in the stripped trees and something else. An engine. Far off, but closing. "They cut the power," she said, barely a sound. "Yes." Damien's grip on her arm tightened once and released, a signal she interpreted as "stay ready." She heard him move. 2 steps, the sound of a drawer, and then a thin beam of light crossed the hall. A flashlight. He swept it once along the corridor checking, and then held it low. "The generator will kick in. 90 seconds. "They know that," Clara said. "Yes." "They have 90 seconds to do whatever they came to do." "Yes." He was already moving toward the stairs. "Stay here, behind the door to the sitting room. Don't come out until the lights are back and you hear my voice." She opened her mouth to argue. She closed it. She had no weapon, no training, no tactical value in a dark corridor. Arguing would just cost him focus. She moved to the sitting room door, pushed it open, stood in the frame. Damien disappeared up the stairs. The dark breathed around her. She counted. She'd always been good at counting. Years of timing table turns, calculating bills, measuring out the hours of a double shift. She counted now and reached 67 before the generator caught, the hum of it rising from somewhere beneath the house, and then the lights came back, all at once, flooding the hall with a brightness that hurt after the dark. Clara blinked. The hall was empty. She could hear from upstairs, controlled and rapid. Voices, footsteps, the sounds of people moving with purpose in a small space. She went to the stairs. She stopped at the bottom. Listened. Salvatore's voice, clipped and commanding. Damien's. A third voice she didn't recognize, higher, stressed. Then nothing. She went up. The third-floor corridor was bright. 3 of Salvatore's men were at the far end, near the secured room's door. The door was open. Salvatore stood in the doorway with his back to the corridor, and at his feet. This was the thing she'd heard, the thing that had sounded like a door impact in the dark. One of Mancini's men was face down on the carpet, with his hands secured behind him with what looked like electrical cord. The man was breathing. That was the first thing Clara checked. Damien turned from the far wall when he heard her on the stairs. His expression told her the immediate crisis was contained before he said anything. "How many?" she asked. 3 came over the east wall during the blackout. This one got to the 3rd floor. He looked at the man on the carpet without particular feeling. The other 2 didn't get past the ground floor. "And Nico?" Damien stepped aside. Nico was sitting on the bed in the secured room, and Salvatore was crouched in front of him exactly the way Clara had crouched behind the dumpster, making himself small, making himself less than the fear, giving the child room. She couldn't hear what he was saying. She could see his hands on his son's shoulders, not gripping this time, just resting. She turned away and gave them the privacy of it. She leaned against the corridor wall and slid down it until she was sitting on the floor with her knees up and her back against the plaster, and she looked at the ceiling and breathed. The adrenaline was metabolizing out of her system in a wave that left every muscle exhausted and her hands trembling very slightly when she held them up to check. She turned them over. The knuckles were scraped from the monitor room. She hadn't noticed that. Damien sat down on the floor beside her without commenting on the fact that they were both on the floor. He held his right arm against his body. It was hurt. She'd registered that hours ago and kept not finding the moment to say anything about it. "Your arm," she said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You've been holding it like that since the study. It's functional." He leaned his head back against the wall. "That's the relevant metric." They sat. Down the corridor, the guards were dealing with the secured man. From the room, the low sound of Salvatore's voice, unhurried now, the cadence of something that was finally being said correctly. "Is it over?" Clara asked. Damien was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, thinking. She'd learned the difference. The immediate situation. Yes. He turned his head to look at her. Mancini. No. They'll try again. They'll try differently. Tonight was... They overplayed. The physical intrusion, the power cut. That level of overt action against Salvatore's property creates exposure for them. Witnesses, evidence, legal liability. He paused. Mancini isn't stupid. They'll absorb this and recalculate. And then what? And then it depends. He held her gaze. On decisions that haven't been made yet. Clara looked down the corridor. The guards were moving the secured man. The room at the end of the hall was still occupied by a father and his son, and whatever was being said in there, whatever was being rebuilt or demolished and rebuilt, it was going to determine more than just the temperature in that room. He has to change, she said. Not a question. He knows that. Knowing and doing. Yes. Damien's mouth tightened. There's a distance between them that he's going to have to walk. He's never had to walk it before. He's always been able to solve problems with the resources he has. Money, people, leverage. A pause. You can't solve a lonely child with leverage. Clara felt the truth of that settle into her like something she'd known for a long time finding its exact right place. What about Carell? She asked. Salvatore will make a decision about him in the morning. Under the circumstances, he stopped. The implication completed itself. Clara didn't push. They sat in the third-floor corridor until Salvatore came out of the room. He'd been in there for close to an hour. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not quite looking at anything, the posture of a man who's just laid something down after carrying it for a very long time and is recalibrating to the absence of the weight. Then he saw Clara on the floor. He looked at her sitting against his corridor wall with her torn jacket and her scraped hands, and he did something she hadn't seen him do once in the hours she'd been in this house. He laughed. Just once. Very short. Mostly air. Not cruel. The laugh of a man who has found something briefly absurd in the middle of an enormous seriousness. You're sitting on the floor, he said. Yes. In my house. Your floors are cleaner than mine. He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked to the opposite wall and sat down against it with a controlled lack of grace that was entirely human, and the two of them sat across from each other in the bright corridor while Damien stood nearby saying nothing, and the house settled around them. He's asleep, Salvatore said. Good. He told me. He stopped. About Tuesday, the dumpster, the milk crate. He looked at his hands, spread them once, and closed them. He told me you sat in the rain. Clara didn't answer. He said you faced away from him, so he didn't feel cornered. Something moved in Salvatore's jaw. I didn't know that. A pause. I didn't know my son could tell the difference between being watched and being given room. He looked at the floor. He's 8 years old and he can read that, and I built a house where nobody ever gave him room. You were trying to protect him, Clara said. I know what I was trying to do. His voice was flat, not defensive, past defense. I also know what I actually did. He looked up. Those are different things. I've spent a long time in the gap between them pretending they were the same. The corridor was very quiet. The school in the city, Clara said. Nico mentioned it. Salvatore nodded once. Damien proposed it 6 months ago. A private school. Discreet security, but discreet. A real building with real students. Routines that exist outside this property. You said no. I said no because the risk assessment was... He stopped himself. I said no because I was afraid. The admission cost him something visible. That's the honest version. Clara looked at this man, the empire and the fear inside it. The love that had curdled into control because control was the only language he knew for protecting things. You can say yes now, she said. I'm aware. He met her eyes. I'm also aware that saying yes to a school doesn't fix what's broken. It's a gesture. What's broken is larger than a gesture. Yes, Clara said, but gestures are where it starts. You do the thing, and then you figure out how to mean it. She paused. That's how most people do it. They don't have the feeling first and then act on it. They act and the feeling catches up. Salvatore studied her. That's a pragmatic view of, I'm a waitress from Ashridge Hollow, Clara said. Pragmatic is what I have. Something settled on his face. The controlled severity. Not gone. That wasn't going anywhere. It was too structural, too load-bearing, but altered. Like a building that's had a window cut into a solid wall. Still standing, light getting through. The problem with Mancini doesn't resolve itself, he said. You understand that? I know. You're connected to this now, to me, to Nico, in ways that don't disappear because you go home. He held her gaze steadily. Your diner is compromised. Your apartment, they know it. Earl Gavin is a liability as long as he owes money to anyone in their network. Clara absorbed this. She'd been turning it over since Damien told her about Earl, the man who'd hired her, who'd slid plates of food through the pass-through with his thermos of whiskey, who'd grumbled at her call-ins but never actually threatened her job. She'd thought about his silences differently now. The way he'd look up sometimes when certain trucks pulled into the lot. The way he'd occasionally disappear into his office for 20 minutes and come back looser, like something had been settled. Debt does things to people. It took the shape of whatever fear they already carried. Earl wasn't a bad man. Earl was a frightened one who'd been made useful by people who were very good at identifying frightened men with useful positions. Earl didn't know what he was doing, she said. Not fully. That's probably accurate, Salvatore said. It doesn't change the practical situation. What do you do with him? Salvatore looked at the wall for a moment. His debt gets purchased. It becomes mine instead of theirs, which means his obligation transfers. He paused. Under the new arrangement, he reports to no one about anything. His position is protected. His debt is managed. A beat. That's the version where he cooperates. And the version where he doesn't? He'll cooperate. Said with the finality of a man who'd had this conversation before in different forms. Clara didn't press. And me? She asked. The question sat in the corridor between them with its full weight. Salvatore looked at her with the directness she'd come to recognize as his baseline. No performance, no softening of the instrument. What do you want, Clara? It was the second time he'd asked. The first time, the lights had gone out. Now the lights were on, the house was secured. His son was asleep in the room at the end of the hall, and she was sitting on a clean floor in a house that was larger than her entire history, and the question was real. She thought about it honestly. She didn't reach for what sounded right or what sounded reasonable. She thought about what was actually true. I want to finish school, she said. I started a nursing program 2 years ago, and I stopped because I ran out of money, and I kept telling myself I'd go back when things settled, and things don't settle. They just keep moving. She paused. I want to go back. I want my mother's medical bills paid off because they've been sitting in my head every single night for 7 years, and I need them to stop. She stopped. And I want to know that Nico is okay, not as a transaction, not as a report I receive from someone. I want to know the way you know things when you've actually looked at them yourself. The corridor was very still. That's all? Salvatore asked. That's everything, Clara said. Don't underestimate what that costs. He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once, the single nod of a man who has heard something that goes into his permanent ledger. The bills are handled by morning, he said. The school, there are programs that will take you with support without debt. Damien will identify the right one. He paused. And Nico. He looked at the closed door. Nico will want to see you. He told me tonight, in that room, that you were the first person who asked him his name and waited for him to give it. A beat. Something shifted in his voice just slightly, the grain of it roughening. He said it felt different from everything else. I want him to have more of that. I don't know how to be that for him, not yet. I'm going to try to learn. He met her eyes. But I'd like him to have it from someone who already knows how. Clara felt her throat tighten. She pressed it down. Okay, she said. Damien drove her back to Ashridge Hollow at 4 a.m, not in the black SUV. A different car, unremarkable, the kind that doesn't get remembered. He drove and she sat in the passenger seat, and neither of them spoke for most of the 2-hour drive. The Pennsylvania dark rolled past the windows and the road was empty, and the heater worked, and somewhere around the 40-minute mark she fell asleep, sitting upright, her head against the cold glass. And when she woke up, they were on the familiar streets of Ashridge Hollow, and the sky was the specific deep blue of just before dawn. Damien stopped outside Kellner's Hardware. The hardware store sign was dark. The street was empty. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, which she found simultaneously comforting and wrong, the way places look wrong when you've changed inside them. "Someone will contact you about the financial arrangements," Damien said, "within 48 hours. Through a lawyer. Legitimate, bar certified, nothing that creates any kind of record that ties back." He looked at her. "Earl will be spoken to today. You don't have to do anything about that." "Okay. If anything feels wrong, anyone watching, anyone asking questions you don't recognize, you call this number." He handed her a card. Plain. A number, no name, different from the one he'd left on her kitchen table the morning before, which felt like a year ago. "Don't use your regular phone. Get a prepaid. Keep it separate. You sound like you're setting up a witness protection situation." "I'm trying to make sure you don't need one." He looked at the street. "Mancini will recalculate. My best judgment is they move to other angles, yet legal, political, not direct action against you. Direct action failed twice in one night, and they're not reckless." He paused. "But my best judgment has been wrong before." "That's reassuring." "I prefer accurate to reassuring." She opened the car door. The cold outside was immediate, the same damp Pennsylvania cold that had been waiting for her since Tuesday, like a thing that hadn't noticed she'd been gone. She stood on the sidewalk. "Damien," she said. He looked at her through the open door. "Your arm," she said. "Get it looked at today, not tomorrow." Something moved in his face, not quite surprise. The expression of a man who doesn't often have people track his injuries. "I will," he said. She closed the door. The car sat for a moment, then pulled away down the empty street, and she watched it go until the taillights disappeared around the corner toward the highway. She stood on the sidewalk in front of Kellner's Hardware in the dark before dawn. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder. Her hands had dried blood on the knuckles. She had her keys and her phone and the card Damien had given her and nothing else. She looked up at her apartment windows, dark, undisturbed, looking exactly as they had every morning for 4 years. She went upstairs. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it, Nico's blanket still on the couch, the glass he'd used on the kitchen counter, 2 plates in the drying rack. She looked at these objects for a moment, the evidence of a child's brief presence, and felt the specific weight of the hours that had separated Tuesday morning from this one. She didn't sleep. She sat on the couch with the blanket across her lap and watched the windows lighten from blue to gray to the pale, flat white of a November dawn, and she thought about her mother. She hadn't let herself do that in the middle of everything. She thought about her now, the way she'd looked in the hospital in the last weeks, small in the bed, but still watching everything, still noticing the way she'd always noticed. "You have too much heart for your own good," her mother used to say, not as a criticism, as a fact. A fact she'd lived with in the way you live with a fact about your own body. Not always conveniently, but completely. She'd found a boy behind a dumpster because she had too much heart. It had pulled her through iron gates and into a fortress, and through a corridor in the dark, and onto the floor of a hallway where a broken man was learning to admit what he'd broken. It had cost her, not everything, but enough that she could feel the weight of the cost the way you feel a healed fracture, present, specific, yours. She picked up the electric bill from the kitchen counter where it had been sitting since Tuesday. $312. She looked at it for a moment, then set it back down. By 9 o'clock, she was showered and dressed and back at Maple House. Earl was behind the counter when she walked in. He looked up. Something happened in his face when he saw her, a series of small, rapid adjustments, a man recalibrating. And then he settled into his usual expression, which she now understood was not neutrality, but practiced concealment. She sat down at the counter. He poured her coffee without being asked. They looked at each other. "You're back," he said. "I'm back." He set the coffee pot down. He looked older this morning. Or maybe she was just seeing what she'd always been looking at without the necessary angle. The gray at his temples, the hands that were slightly unsteady on the coffee pot, the eyes of a man who'd been managing a private fear for so long that the management had become the biggest thing in him. "Earl," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said, simply. Not to wound him, just because it was true and because the truth needed to be in the room. He stood very still for a long time. The diner was empty at this hour. Just the two of them, the stools and the booths, and the smell of burned coffee and bacon grease and old wood that she'd walked into 4 years ago with nothing and had come to understand as a kind of home. "Clara," he started. "You don't have to explain it," she said. "I understand how it works. The debt and the conditions. I understand that you probably thought you were doing something small, something that didn't hurt anyone." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. "I understand that by the time you understood what you were actually doing, you were too deep to see the way out." His jaw worked, his eyes went wet, and he pressed his mouth flat and looked at the counter. "I never meant—" "I know. That boy. If anything had happened to that boy because of—" He stopped. His voice had broken and he put a fist to his mouth and breathed until it steadied. "I didn't know he was there. I didn't know you had him until the men came in. And then you told someone." A pause. "My phone, I sent a message." He looked at her. "It was automatic. I didn't even—" "It was automatic." Clara looked at him. She thought about the word automatic, about all the things people did automatically, because they'd been doing them long enough that the decision had been made so many times it had stopped being a decision. She thought about the way she'd crouched behind a dumpster automatically, because her body had decided before her mind that the breathing mattered. "Your debt is being managed," she said. "As of today. The arrangement you had with those people is over. There's a new arrangement." She watched his face. "You don't have to report to anyone about anything. You just run your diner." He stared at her. "Who?" "It doesn't matter who. It's done." She picked up her coffee. "I'm going to need next week off." Earl blinked. "What?" "I'm looking into going back to school. I need time to sort out the paperwork." She held the mug in both hands. "Can you cover my shifts?" He stood in the silence of the diner and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not gratitude, that was too simple. Something more complicated than gratitude. The look of a man who has been carrying something terrible for years and has had it taken from him without being asked to earn the taking. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can cover." She nodded. She drank her coffee. Outside the windows, Ashridge Hollow went about its morning, trucks on the highway, a woman walking a dog down the empty sidewalk, the flat November sky sitting low over the town the way it always did. The weeks that followed were not clean. That was the truth of it, the part that didn't simplify no matter how long she turned it over. Damien's lawyer arrived on Friday, a woman named Carver, precise and humorless, who walked Clara through documents she was allowed to take and given time to read. The nursing program acceptance came in December. A school in Pittsburgh, full support. She could start in January if she wanted. She wanted. The Mancini situation moved the way Damien had predicted, toward legal and political channels, away from anything direct. She wasn't contacted again. She didn't know what that cost Salvatore and decided she didn't need to. Some knowledge is only burden. Earl started closing the diner 2 Sundays a month to drive to see his sister in Harrisburg, which he hadn't done in 4 years. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. Some changes speak for themselves. She saw Nico for the first time in 6 weeks on a Saturday in late November. Damien drove him to Pittsburgh, where she'd been staying in a temporary apartment near the nursing school campus, and she met them in a coffee shop near the university. Public, ordinary, the kind of place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. Nico came in wearing a school uniform she didn't recognize. He'd had his hair cut recently. He looked like a different boy, and the same boy simultaneously, which was exactly right, which was exactly how it should be. He sat across from her. She bought him a hot chocolate. He wrapped both hands around the mug in a way that was pure muscle memory, and she remembered the milk crate in the storage room and the juice box, and felt the weeks between then and now as a physical distance traveled. "How's school?" she asked. "It's okay." He looked into his mug. There's a kid named Marcus who thinks he's funny but isn't. A pause. He's getting better, though. That's a very generous read. I'm practicing. He looked up. My dad says I have to be around people long enough to find out what they actually are instead of what they seem like. Clara raised her eyebrows slightly. Your dad said that. He's been saying a lot of things. Nico's expression was complicated. Still that adult quality. The too old gravity, but something lighter moving underneath it now. Not gone. Just not the only thing. He ate breakfast with me every day this week. Every day? Every day. He was quiet for a moment. He burned the toast twice. He didn't tell anyone. He just ate it. Clara felt the image settle in her. Salvatore De Luca at a kitchen table, eating burned toast, not telling anyone, being a person in the ordinary domestic sense for the first time in what was probably years. She pressed her lips together against the thing that wanted to rise in her chest. Good, she said. He's not good at it yet, Nico said. Being, normal. Nobody is at first. Were you? She thought about 17, about the hospital, about the diner counter and the electric bills and the apartment above the hardware store and the years of moving through her own life like something the current was carrying. No, she said. I'm still not, mostly. Nico nodded, processing this, and she watched him file it away in the particular way he filed things. Not as comfort, exactly, but as data. Evidence of how the world actually worked instead of how it was supposed to. Clara, he said. Yeah? Thank you. He looked at her with those dark, too clear eyes. Not for the pancakes. A beat. For all of it, after. She looked at him across the table. 8 years old, already carrying the weight of a story most adults never had to live. Already learning, in the fumbling, necessary way of all children who've been given slightly too much too soon, how to set some of that weight down. You don't need to thank me, she said. You gave me something too. He frowned slightly. What? She wrapped her hands around her own mug. Outside the coffee shop window, Pittsburgh moved past in the gray November light, people and traffic and all the machinery of a city going about its daily business of being alive. Inside it was warm, and the hot chocolate was steaming, and the boy across from her was looking at her with an expression that was slowly, carefully, figuring out what it meant to trust someone. You reminded me that it mattered, she said. What I did. Who I was when I did it. She looked at the window. I'd been doing the right thing for a long time without anyone seeing it. I was starting to wonder if it mattered whether anyone saw it. And now? Nico asked. Clara looked back at him. Now I know it always mattered, she said. The scene was never the point. He absorbed this, turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. My dad wants to meet you again, he said. Properly. Not in a crisis. I know, Damien mentioned it. Are you going to? She considered the question. Not whether to answer yes, but what yes actually meant. Salvatore De Luca was not a simple answer. He was a dangerous man who was trying, with the particular grinding difficulty of a man who had built his entire self in the wrong direction, to become a slightly better one. He would not fully succeed. He would not stop being what he was. He would make compromises and decisions that she would not be able to endorse or fully know. That was the truth. The other truth was that his son was sitting across from her in a coffee shop in Pittsburgh, in a school uniform with hot chocolate and a story about a classmate named Marcus who was getting better, and whatever machinery of change had been set in motion in a fortress at the end of a long dark night was running, imperfectly, forward. Yes, she said, at some point. Nico nodded, satisfied. They sat together in the warm coffee shop while the city moved past outside, and Clara thought about dumpsters and rain and the particular way a frightened child's breathing sounds when it hasn't yet decided whether to trust you. She thought about the woman who'd walked out to the trash on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and the distance between that woman and the one sitting here now, and whether the distance was loss or growth, or just the shape that living takes when you stop flinching from it. She thought about her mother, about too much heart for your own good, said not as a warning, but as a description, an accurate one, a permanent one. Outside, snow was starting, the first of the season, thin and tentative, the kind that melts before it settles. It came down against the coffee shop window in small, dissolving particles, and Nico turned to look at it with a child's immediate unguarded interest, his chin lifting, his profile against the glass, and in that moment he looked exactly like what he was, a boy watching snow in a warm place with someone nearby. Clara watched him watch it. She drank her coffee. The snow kept coming down,